So academic support, we get our surveys back at the end of every year, and what we can see is that actually our sacrificial lamb, Life 229, wasn't too much change. But the learning outcomes achieved, students, despite it being a hybrid approach, were able to see that they did improve. On top of that, we've then also got the Life 227 module, and what we can see is there was a large increase in the perception of the students, what they understood from the module. And I'm just going to show some of these individual quotes, which I'll flash up, just to show that feedback that it was there. It's not just an overall opinion, but individually, they found a lot of these sessions really interesting. Next approach was to create that sense of community that I know we've already talked about, somebody touched upon. One of the most important things was not just interacting with students to the staff, but creating this student-to-student network as well. And that's something that we felt this module thrived upon. Using Microsoft Teams, they were able to integrate with each other, and it even got to the point where they started answering each other's questions and having that peer-to-peer learning mentality, which was fantastic. Started to create this micro-community between staff, students, technical team, and we also wanted to include that inclusivity. So as part of our outward-looking curriculum, being able to not just shoehorn in, but fully integrate, looking at decolonising the curriculum, diversity, equality within the module itself. We were able to build these in through either recorded sessions that were given whilst the students were off learning, or in some of the modules in pre-recorded sessions. And this helped really well. And one of the other really important aspects is to kind of foster that fun mentality in that relationship. And again, I hope some of the feedback is able to show that. But we think we did that through some quizzes. We had a Christmas quiz, which was quite interesting. And also through that day-to-day interaction and making the students understand how we're actually approaching the module. It's not just there to learn the information solidly, but also to have a bit of fun. And again, you can see from some of the quotes that we hope that we did start to foster that sense of community. And the peer-to-peer learning was fantastic as well. Touching on skills and technology, it's quite self-explanatory what this was, but using digital fluency and a lot of the skills based around some of the technologies, online programs, we're able to get students to analyse data sets in real-life settings, and using the early career researchers and also postgraduate demonstrators that were actively embedded into understanding some of these tools, we think that that was really beneficial. And again, for assessment and feedback, that feed-forward approach, we were able to improve how students visualised the feedback, what they thought of it and the quality of it. And that's all from that online approach, so it's something that we definitely hope that we can begin to take forward. As a final topic, and probably one of the most important, but something that's often quite overlooked within practicals, is the support network. Particularly during the middle of a pandemic, a lot of the students had other things going on, and as I've already alluded to, students with maybe caring responsibilities, international students, it was about making sure they felt part of the team, but also supported throughout the sessions. Having a number of members of staff that were integrated into the disability network or academic advisory positions did help, and that was incredibly beneficial. And continued feedback and guidance, signposting to support services, and most importantly, being able to monitor the students as well to see if any were struggling, helped foster that kind of community support network, but also identify students that we needed to maybe pay attention to. And again, the impact of that was to have it accessibility to all students and to remove those barriers to learning that were in place previously. So at the start, we had that fear of delivery with these large cohorts. Where do we go next? How do we do this? But the students drove us forward throughout the whole thing, knowing that this was something we wanted to have them to go away with and get that full learning experience. So after we've rested, reflected, and took everything in, we realised this was quite a success. And the student-driven learning development that we feel we fostered has helped them greatly and been able to kind of fill that gap, particularly in the hybrid learning model. We've been able to break down those barriers to learning, to be able to solve some of the issues around support, but not everything. And we hope that this will feed forward. So we've already started across one part of the campus, and we hope to make that as far forward as possible. So as a final thing, we have begun to put a toolkit together of a practical pathway to identify if a hybrid, online, or fully face-to-face model is appropriate, and I'm happy to talk about that with anyone that would have any interests. And thanks to everybody involved, Nigel, all of the people related to online learning, and my team at the university themselves as well. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Sean. We've got time for one question, I think, on that inspiring work. Who's got a question? Someone's got a question.
It's actually a question for all three of you or four of you who've spoken. It's, you talk about community of learners, don't you, the students. I guess we're also a community of learners, educators. Do you think we actually share these sorts of approaches enough within our community? I mean, it seems to me, we're hearing about this after a year of doing this, and that's great. But do you think we do enough during the year to actually share sort of approaches to make things a bit easier for everybody? I just wonder, I know it's a very general question, it's not specific to you, but is there more that we could do, do you think, in this community to actually share these ideas, which are all really good?
I think certainly. I think that part of what we've shown and what other individuals have shown is building towards that goal of particularly Dry Labs Real Science. Being able to present to multiple people at multiple times will allow us to share that information. I think part of the problem with us all, we've all been quite isolated in terms of university groups because we've all been so busy. I know I don't think I speak for myself when I say that if it's not one thing, it's another, if it's students, planning curricula, things like that. But actually having been able to take that time away to discuss with each other like we have today and kind of impart that knowledge across the board to the other universities, other faculties, is something that we at Liverpool strive to do, and I would be more than delighted to be involved in those discussions. I don't know if Angela, have we got any other opinions on that?
I'm sure they do. We should save them for the refreshments break. Thank you so much, Sean. That's great to know. Our next talk is Enzyme Kinetics, Simulation in Excel, and it's Andy Bates again from the University of Liverpool.
Hello folks, thanks very much for the invitation. So we're going for something much more specific here, which I hope some of you will find interesting, at least. But it arose out of the same kind of considerations about how to get students to understand what may be a rather practical thing, but in a more simulation-driven way, and this is enzyme kinetics. So I teach a biological chemistry course and also a second-year biochemistry practical course, where the students basically have to understand this thing, Michaelis-Menten equation and its relationship to the saturation curve as you increase the substrate of an enzyme catalyzed reaction. And they not only need to understand that, but if they're going to design experiments around this, they need to understand something more than that, which is how you set up the experiment affects the data you get out of this kind of thing. And in particular, they need to understand, and we probably, when we think about it, need to understand what happens over time with the enzyme reaction. And that's something that's quite hard to get at. Slightly surprisingly, although the Michaelis-Menten equation has been known for over 100 years, the actual sort of analytical solution to what happens to the substrate over time was only actually worked out in 1997 with the aid of sort of heavy-duty algebraic software. And that's the equation. Don't worry about the equation, but it's S, the substrate concentration in terms of time over here. And it relies on a mathematical function that I had never heard of until I started thinking about this, and perhaps you have never either. It's called Lambert W. So if you're not interested in enzyme kinetics, then one thing you can take away from today is that you've learned a new mathematical function that you never knew existed. It's called Lambert W, or the omega function. In this case, it's W of all of this. And its definition is this, that the W of x times e to the power of the W of x is equal to x, which is obscure, but if you compare it to the definition of the natural log, where e to the log x is just equal to x, then you can see the relationship there. It's sort of kind of related in some way. Anyway, that's an aside. You need to know that in order to simulate what happens to the substrate concentration. And with that, you can start to look at interesting peculiarities of what happens to your substrate over time in an enzyme reaction. If you have a lot of substrate, this is kind of saturating substrate, about 10 times the km of substrate, for those who think about these things, then the enzyme reaction behaves really rather linearly. And once you have these equations, you can also build in some other useful stuff, such as the fact that very many enzymes are inhibited by their product. So that when the product builds up, you get an additional inhibition of the reaction, and the sort of gold-coloured points here represent the divergence away from a situation where you don't have product inhibition. But if you, this paper down here works out the equations for product inhibition, it's very, very useful. If you have a low substrate concentration, everything is a whole lot less linear in terms of what happens over time. Crucial part about this is when you come to design an experiment, that V against S curve that everybody knows about for the Michaelis-Menten equation relies on having the initial rate of the reaction rather than the rate after a certain time. But you have to estimate that by doing the reaction for a certain time in general and then averaging the rate over that time. And if you do it for too long, everything goes wrong. So what I've done is I've built a simulation in Excel which will allow you to look at exactly those things. It allows you to alter the parameters, first of all, of your enzyme, so the Kcat, the catalytic rate of your enzyme, the Km, and then the parameter which describes how much the enzyme is inhibited by its product. We'll come back to these in a moment. But also what you might call the experimental parameters, the substrate concentration you start with, how much enzyme you start with, and crucially the time over which you then measure the rate to estimate the initial rate. Now in a kind of lab practical situation, that's usually quite a long time actually. It also depends on the parameters of your enzyme. This is set up for our favourite enzyme, which is alkaline phosphatase, the easiest enzyme to assay in the world, perhaps. But you can see that if you are in this situation, if you allow 30 seconds for your measurement of the initial rate, which would actually be quite good going for students in the lab, then first of all, it makes a difference if you have product inhibition. Alkaline phosphatase is inhibited by phosphate. But what you can then is you can use these data, which have been generated by the model, to recalculate the Km and Vmax by fitting the curve to the equation. And you can see that although the Vmax is well calculated here, it should be 0.4, it's up here somewhere, down here. The Km is overestimated quite badly by the rate being different from what you expected. So this allows you to play with this to work out what happens. If you change the time over which you measure the rate to 5 minutes, which is something that students can easily manage, in this situation, the Michaelis-Menten curves now look quite weird indeed. And if you compute the parameters from these data, they turn out to be really wildly different from what they should be. The Km should be 20 micromolar, and it's like over 100 in these simulations. So this gives you an opportunity to kind of mess around with the enzyme parameters and the parameters of your experiment and kind of work out what would be a good experiment to do. And that's kind of what I had in mind when I wanted to set this up. It also deals with inhibition, so you can turn on either competitive or uncompetitive inhibition, or a mixture of the two, and see what happens. And you can generate families of curves that are inhibited by more increasing concentrations of enzymes, the sort of thing that you've all seen in the textbooks, but this is kind of manipulable. And then the Lineweaver-Burke plots, which have their characteristic shape depending on the type of inhibition that's involved. Same thing for uncompetitive. I won't bore you with the details, but you then get a nice characteristic pattern in the reciprocal plot describing the type of inhibition that's going on. And so the simulation allows you to mess around with that as well. how am I doing for time? Good. I might just be able to show you it working. It's just an Excel file. It's not that swish to look at, but anyway. Let me see. There we go. That's kind of what it looks like. You won't be able to see it in a whole lot of detail, but if you adjust the parameters at the side here, I'm just going to make a k-cap quite a lot bigger than it is initially. You will see that all the curves change, and you can turn on and off inhibition and see what happens. And then, this is a slide about it, you can compute the KM and Vmax according to the data that have been generated by the model over this period of time that you specify for measuring the rate, and then those numbers come out at the bottom. So this is a tool, I think, that actually is quite useful for me, really, to sort of have a play around with and try and understand everything, perhaps even better than I could to start with. But certainly for the students, in the context of giving them a kind of tutorial workthrough, I think, to kind of look through this and see how it works, I think will be valuable for them to get a handle on what's going on, and perhaps to help them design an experiment for a real practical situation as well. Okay. So finally, I've just got some sort of final comments. So limitations. Well, this is not some Swish online thing. Could be made into one, I suppose, if I had the wherewithal to do it. But Excel's good at plotting graphs, so that made it easy for me. You require your students not to be afraid to turn macros on for their Excel file to make this work. And also you need to install the solver unit, which many of you may have used to solve nonlinear equations in Excel. That needs to be turned on in order to compute the Km and the Vmax from those curves. I think the developments would involve making kind of tutorials which lead students through this, I think, so that they can use it properly. And I haven't done that yet because I've just done this, and I'm going to see what happens really with that, I think. The other thing that one could do in a situation where you couldn't get into the lab is something I did do last year with a much more simple-minded version of this, which is to use this, as in the Dry Labs Real Science, to generate data sets, as Nigel already talked about. So to generate data sets with imperfect data, these are obviously perfected data, for the students then to analyse subsequently. Thanks to my biological chemistry and advanced biochemical techniques students for showing me that they didn't understand this and they needed better tools to understand it. And thank you to you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andy. That is excellent. I guess if I could ask you a question, maybe just to clarify, have you just used this formatively so far? Did you sort of put this on your VLE and allow your students to explore it?
I used a very simple version of this for them to explore, but mostly what I used a very early version to do was, while they were sitting in groups, in teams, not doing their practical work in the lab, to generate data for them, but adding error to the output of the data, which is also something that's quite easy to do in Excel. The best way to do that is to generate a random number with a normal distribution around the point associated with their imprecision of pipetting, largely, which, as we all know, is the major factor involved here. To sort of just tune that until it looks like the typical graphs that the students produce, and say, okay, you can have that as your data. But so that's what I'd like to do, and I haven't done this yet, it's kind of early days, is to work through tutorials which would lead them through this. If you just let them play with it, you'd rapidly overwhelm them with confusion, I think. I think you're going to need to lead students through it. I haven't done that yet. So.
Was that a hand up, Dave?
Yeah.
Let me give you the microphone.
Thanks, Andy. I can actually see a huge benefit for this, and actually an interactive tutorial where you can say, if we change this, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Why? and then lead them through it, and by the end of it, you've actually accomplished all the things you know.
Exactly, I think that's right. It's going to be a walkthrough, and then after that, you can just let them play with it.
Yes.
There's a reset button, by the way, so you can put it back how it's done.
Yeah.
So it's kind of crucial.
Really, you can get the whole thing of an enzyme kinetics out of it.
Yeah, I think so.
Brilliant. Okay, well thanks again, Andy, that's very, very good.
I'd be happy to share that file, by the way.
Oh yeah, that's an obvious question, yeah. Please can you send it? Yeah. Okay, brilliant, thanks again. Okay, all right. For our final swap shop session, swap shop talk in this session, we've got Dr. Gordon from Sheffield talking about how did the pandemic change our lab teaching and how do we move forward.
I'd like to thank James and Liz for giving me a chance to come and talk to you. A couple of things here. One thing I've noticed, probably like you over the pandemic, recording videos, my timekeeping has gone out the window. So this is absolutely brilliant practice for 2 hours time, standing in a lecture theatre in front of 300 students. So I'm sure I'll get a reminder in 10 minutes when I haven't reached that time. I was a bit worried at lunch when I thought, I'm the last of 5 talks on the same topic. This is going to be a bit of deja vu. So hopefully it'll be a bit different, and it's about Sheffield. Just note, a few of you may know some of the other people. Up until last Wednesday, I was in the Department of Biomedical Sciences. We became the School of Biosciences. I no longer have any idea who I am, what I'm doing, and what happens on the 20th September. I'm relying on Emma to tell me that when we start in a couple of weeks' time. To come on to the topics. So, the initial lockdown, mad panic, was a little bit ahead of that curve, because I teach a respiratory practical, and we decided it wasn't good to have students blown over each other at that time. So, luckily, the Laura Horns in the department managed to wrangle us a free trial of LT, the large piece of software, by 80 instruments. This worked really well as a really quick interface to use and develop. So we were using that, and it allowed us to give these delivery of virtual physiology labs, set them up very quickly. So we had a nice suite of pre-existing work. We made videos for the class. We would take these videos and embed them in the LT. We were able to take advantage of the LT features with dummy data, one we prepared earlier. So, and in fact, using the class, the dummy data, I did a preamble video as well, where I just changed it to virtual rather than the one they had before. And this was part of a pre-lab. And something we talked about with the pre-labs earlier, one advantage of this, the LT system, is they have to commit, or you can make them commit, so they can do their health and safety bit and everything else and commit before they actually see the real practical. So that can help, or will help next year. Again, do they do it, or just tick the box? You know. So this worked, and I found this system very quick to set up and use, so I could take lessons already in LT, what we'd done, and within a few hours we had a working practical that was as good as you. It was like being in the class, apart from you weren't blown over at each other at the time. So this worked very well. So moving on to this year, this academic year, obviously we faced a huge problem, social distancing. This is the view of the lab. If you did your degree in 1990 or finished in 1990 like me, this is probably what you'd normally see. We'd usually expect to see maybe 12 or 15 students in that view. So you have two who are very good at the computer doing the experiment, and one student who's brilliant at talking to everybody else. So we're going from classes, normally we're having to triplicate classes, we're going from a class of 90 down to 30. So we also have this problem as everyone else, large number of students studying remotely, and the ones who caught COVID or self-isolating in flats, which meant we were repeating classes 6 times, sometimes 7, as an extra catch-up class. Obviously, not particularly sustainable, and I really praised the semester 1 staff last year getting through that. So how do we get around all these problems? Right, so essentially this is something we've been thinking, well, we've been meaning to do this for years and years, getting on update with the computer systems and things like that. But usually you get to July, you're absolutely bloody exhausted after the year, and you use the energy to do the development. So it was forced upon us this year. We upgraded the AV equipment, so we had 3 or 4 very expensive cameras, nice cameras, high-quality cameras. We could capture video from all these cameras together, the input from the microphones, the wireless mics we had in the lab, and Andrew Metcalf, the chief technician, used this package to develop the software so we could have live streams, we could have live video in videos of the classes being streamed out, and capturing all the material and capturing the labs. So coming on to what we actually are doing in the classes. So we see Paul Gakari here demonstrating the lab. So the staff were able to deliver the class to demonstrate the techniques in real time. And we're recording this now. We've got a huge library of videos to use for biochemical and basic molecular biology labs. If people are interested, I'm sure they'll be happy to share all this material. So we have live camera feeds out to the lab screens. So live feeds around the monitors. We also set up the students with headphones at each individual computer as well. So each student had their own computer, so they were able to look at the protocols online. And this is early version, this was being done in Google Sites, but we're moving everything onto LT this year. So this live video audio stream went out to Blackboard Collaborate as well. So we had a live, in real time, the labs were running live on Blackboard Collaborate. So it'd be accessible in the lab on the lab computers here or wherever they were in the world. Students could access the lab in real time. Something we also did was we live streamed out to Google Meets. I think Sheffield may have been a bit stingy in their Blackboard subscription, but using Google Meets allowed us to have the live captioning. So the screens, the practicals were being live captioned at the same time, going out to the lab computers or to the home computers. We had a number of profoundly deaf students who really appreciated this approach with the captioning. And while the students were getting on and doing their work, we were able to record the videos. Now we think the probably advantage of this is that we've got our equipment. It's doing our equipment. It's not like getting a Joe video or another video source where they've got lovely brand new equipment that's a high-end spec compared to ours. The students actually see with our beat-up old equipment what they were meant to do. So semester 2 this year, well, we were back in our virtual labs using LT. We ran classes on the synchronous conditions, and I'll mention a few bits and pieces here. Blackboard Collaborate, and students were split up into breakout rooms. Some positives and negatives about that to do the classes. So I know we were talking about communities, so the students will be split into their tutorial groups in breakout rooms to work through LT classes and groups. And the second half after Easter, we were back in class using the LT and Power Lab, fairly much as we would do normally, but very much social distanced, and still, which became a problem when you're trying to do experiments. We've got someone zapping your nerve in the arm. It's hard to do that on yourself. Various things. So we had stand at arm's length to electrocute each other, but apart from that, it did seem to work. So, where are we going for this? Advantages and disadvantages? Well, less paper waste. I think when we started looking at this, it was like £7,000 a year for the physiology classes on paper. Smaller class sizes, so students were working individually. This has got the bonus, I think I mentioned it down there further on, the students couldn't hide behind their partners. So the student who's very good at talking actually has to do the work this time, so they can't hide behind people. So going to these smaller class sizes has been a big advantage. With these embedded videos, the labs were running much more smoothly. So the students had their headphone, they could sit at their computer, watch all the instructional videos, how to do it, this is what we did earlier. So we had fewer questions, fewer problems encountered, and we found we could run a big class with just 2 academic staff and not need demonstrators, although I do acknowledge that has pros and cons because we are training demonstrators as well. But we can use fewer demonstrators. The remote students loved the classes, the live stream of classes. They said it made them feel like they were actually in Sheffield taking part. So it developed that sense of community in them. So they couldn't hide. Cost, we have as a department or a school now, a significant investment in the LT platform. It's about £23 per license for students, but that's being balanced by our printing costs. This working in groups wasn't popular with some students. They said they'd turn up in their group, no one would talk to them, or they would log in and then disappear for a cup of tea. So when you looked, when you sort of checked in the room, you could see there were 6 students there, but they weren't actually taking part in the class. So there are pros and cons to that breakout room for labs. So just what are we going to do next? So combining the best practice for the last 18 months. So we're investing so that we can increase our class numbers, so maybe have 50 or 60 students in the class rather than the maximum of 30 to 40 with computers. So each student will have their own computer, their own online protocols. We're using our strike funds for the department, high quality noise cancelling headphones. That would be the problem of playing through loudspeakers, having 60 sets of the same audio, slightly out of sync with each other, being played. I'm sure it would drive somebody crazy. We've got this huge library of recordings, which we can edit and use now. And so we're switching to LT across all of our level 1 and 2 practical classes. And the start of classes, we're going to continue with this live streaming and demonstration approach across the lab and to Blackboard. And cost-wise, it does mean we have fewer demonstrators. Just to acknowledge a few people have been involved over the last year. Andy Metcalf has taken a huge lead on this. He was awarded the Vice Chancellor's Prize for digital innovation for the work he did getting our labs up to speed. Although he's not sure if he's got a job coming back next week. Paul, Mohammed and Laura also played a huge role in getting this all together. So it's been a great team effort, hopefully a bit different from the other talks, but I'm happy to discuss and talk about the videos later on. And if I was a lecturer, I'd be being kicked out by now, I think.
I know, you're doing yourself
just 1 minute over.
Perfect. Any questions for go on.
So I'm really interested in the work because some of the stuff that Sean presented about Life 229 is very similar practical. One of the big issues we encounter, because we use LT and we've been using it for a few years, is with live streaming for students in China and other partner universities. There were real problems with the live stream being really poor quality. So in terms of your student cohort, do you have a demographic where there were any issues like that?
Not like that. The live streaming was going out through Blackboard Collaborate.
Okay.
So I think that did work okay from what I heard.
The streaming software that you used and the cameras, what sort of setup did you have for that?
That's going you'd have to speak to Andrew. Yeah, I think he has another job outside the university.
Probably paid better.
Just DJing elsewhere. That's right. That's exactly what he's doing. I'm surprised he hasn't got a little ball. He has actually got a little ball in the park somewhere.
Thanks, Gordon. Part question, part comment. We've all developed some really good online remote practical, etc., but also built in a lot of other things. So we built in huge experimental design components. It'd be a real shame if we went back to our old ways. What do you intend to do with regard to taking what really worked this year and combining what you had previously to combine sort of a hybrid approach? Or are you going back to your old ways?
No, I think very much we're going to continue using this approach. Certainly some of the live streaming, the LT is working brilliantly. The LT works, you can actually create real data. So we're going to carry on using this type of approach. And we're expanding our LT licenses to accommodate this. Some of the streaming, I think we won't be talking about remote students this year. It's a big no-no at Sheffield. Sheffield students are going to be back in Sheffield and attending lectures. And we've got some nasty emails to write about that in the next few days. So the remote side of it won't be as big, but I think the videos, all the other material, I think we can build on that and make it better. It's been a learning curve figuring out. I know at Liverpool you've been using it, Aberdeen have been using the LT to great effect.
Question from several of the people who've spoken. I think a lot of what I've seen is how you model what is done in practicals, but I've not heard so much about how you arrive at what is to be done. A little bit like the experimental design that David was just talking about, which is sometimes the hardest thing, but the most important thing that they get from practicals is what it is they're going to do, using what equipment and with what controls and how many replicates and blah, 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 blah.
How do we get there, or?
Yeah, so lots of the things are demonstrating how practicals are actually done, the mechanics of it. But what I was interested in is how the students get through that thought process themselves. If they were having to start with a clean sheet of paper, how they come about designing the experiment, what it is they're going to do, using what reagents, what concentrations, how many replicates, all these things. Because we often give it them.
Yes, and I think that's probably essentially what we've done is taken the handbooks and turned them into online resources, and that's a hard bit. I have been building a level 3 practical with this, with the ideas that this is what you do. Now, this is just to give you the idea. Now you go away and do your own experiment. So it's using to set up an experiment like this. This is what a dose-response curve with DIDS looks like, and this is what it does with zero chloride and things like that. Now go away and you've got to come up with an experiment you do in the next 2 labs. So it's sort of showing them techniques, what's achievable with the techniques, but then they've got to go away and come up with a hypothesis. So try to expand on that and build on that at level 3 practicals, but level 1 and 2 seems to be much more with these building on what we've done already.
That's a great place to finish, I think, with that sort of expansion toward experimental design and the way that you can build on virtual labs and teach those skills. Thank you so much to all of the speakers. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, everyone, for that very illuminating session. It's time for a refreshments break. Thanks again.
Okay.
shows that we've got done something like these
attendance is going to go down, and the students were very vocal about it. I started there.
Yeah.
so they have before they get touched.
Yeah.
But when I'm actually doing practice, you can turn the valves and see what's going on by the way. And it basically explodes.
We've got no policy.
You fail to get. So they all the equipment in a safe way. And also, if they know it's about I know why there's a component in it.
Yeah.
Whereas here, students, that's why, if I was having to try and develop people,
Some kind of question.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it falls down because it doesn't actually simulate the actual teacher, but it does go they had to decide what they were going to do well.
I think what I found is
does it show you as a teacher the steps, sort of the wind downs they went down?
They have to fill out, I'm showing you how to do it. Actually, doesn't have a depth with me. I mean, they had to fill out.
they realized they had to do the work.
Does it mean before they present this to you as a finished design in version 5? Version 4 is version 3.
Not reward
Because then, intrinsically, what you hope when they're trying to design experiments in the future, they'll remember the element of mistakes, systematic examples.
I recorded with anything.
Because, I don't if I make a mistake today, it has to get to the back. You want to do it again.
Yeah.
If they had to come in on Saturday morning and do experiment again, okay, we myself can't do that.
No. I mean, with the numbers of students, I think with the numbers of students, there's a limitation on how much error
Exactly. What that's intended to do to us is adapt to our experiments. So that they're easy.
we're quite everything's adapted to
So, we're trying. So I've had a student.
It's not something that they can But the buzz you get, when this is awesome, this is so much fun. How would you take this to you? And it's just like this little, it's that polish. That's the best way to describe it. Oh, man. If you go down Star Wars route, don't do what I did and create my own.
The thing is, I wouldn't go down the Star Wars because I've got no clue about Star Wars and
There's so many out there you can use. Don't try and create your own. Just go and Google whatever film it is intro you want. There's Game of Thrones, there's Stranger Things, Star Wars, Star Trek, whatever you like.
I'll need to catch up with you. Okay.
Yeah.
He's going into his third year, right? His final year, rather. Yeah. This is the first time he's done it, I presume. Okay, yeah. 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 absolutely fine to be absolutely candid here. So your recommendation is that in this instance, because it's the first time he's applied, we say yes, but with a very strong caveat that the further of these grants will not be upheld. Yeah, the usual thing, but also with the suspension or taking time out to. Yeah, so So I'll put that in the letter or email back to say strongly recommend that the student talks to the directors of studies to consider the pathway which involves either suspension or optimum academic. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. You can only take it so far, and after that, it's their decision. Yeah. Okay? Yeah, absolutely fine with that. Okay? No worries. Yeah. I'll send it later. All right. Take care. Bye. Bye.
1, 2, 1, 2. Hello, Ellie, can you hear me?
Hi James, I can, yes, thanks.
Brilliant. And maybe you can see me as well.
Yep, now I can. Yeah, good to see you.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, how's the first half of the conference going?
It's going really well, thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm probably looking very strange because I'm looking up at you on the big screen. I should be looking at the camera.
No worries, I get it.
Yeah, it's going well. We've got a good turnout. We've got about 35 people live, and we've got quite a few people following the live stream as well.
Great.
Everyone's outside. In case you're wondering, where everyone is, they're all outside enjoying refreshments in the sunshine. We've got a lovely day today, so everyone's outside.
Good.
Which is not a given either in Washington or in the UK.
No, exactly. And for us, kind of especially this time of year, the weather is definitely changing to more fall.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, I mean, the few times I've been to Washington State, it always feels like quite an English climate, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So you're coming out of the two speakers loud and clear.
Great.
I'm going to turn up the volume just slightly. Last time that wasn't working, but let's see if that works now. Okay. Do you want to just say testing or something?
Sure. Yeah. Testing.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's worked.
Great.
And we tried sharing the screen before, didn't we? So we.
Yeah. Let me make sure I know how to do that.
Yeah, because now you'll have forgotten again because you've been using Zoom or something.
Exactly. Okay, let's see. You're probably seeing my notes too, right?
Yeah, if you had any,
There we go.
yeah.
Let's turn that on. Is that good?
Yeah, that's really good.
Great.
Except
Okay,
now,
I'll stop.
unfortunately, your face has disappeared. I can just see.
Oh.
I don't know why it's turned off the camera, or it's decided not.
Interesting.
Look, now
Let me see.
Yeah, now you're back.
But just my face, not. Oh, sorry. Yeah, just my face, not the.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a big deal. I just noticed that when you shared your slides, your face disappeared, and it's always, just slightly nicer to be able to see the speaker, but it's not a deal breaker. Now you've gone again.
Right. Now I'm gone again, huh? Okay, let's see. I wonder, turn off. Okay, no. Yeah, I don't know. Do you know how to change that setting?
Well, it depends how you're using Teams. Have you got the app installed, or are you doing it through the web?
I'm doing it through the web.
Okay. Yeah, in that case, then maybe I don't know, because I always use it through the app. But on the app, if you click your account, like we may say ET or I don't know.
Yeah.
Try clicking on that, and it might give you some kind of settings options.
Yep. Let's see. Let's see.
And there might be some way of kind of fixing the camera on, but honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't see it. I can change the theme, dark or light.
That's nice.
Yeah.
I think forget it, Ellie. And honestly,
Okay.
I think, as we said before, just maybe just when you begin, just to show yourself and just give a little introduction, and then you can share the slides. And then when you take questions, just turn it off, and we'll make sure that we can see you.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's great.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, I think we're good then. So we've got the lady who's chairing the next session is called Momna. So her first name is Momna. Momna.
Great.
Just in case. Well, she'll be kicking things off.
Great.
And I'll be lurking around just out of camera shot, just waiting for something to go wrong. We've already had the live stream go down once this morning.
Shoot. Yeah, I saw that on the Slack actually.
But I guess that's what happens if you try and do 10 things at once. Something you get more chances for things to go wrong.
Right. Exactly. But it looks like it got fixed pretty quickly too. So.
Yeah. I don't know what the problem was. But we're in this Victorian room. I mean, I wish the building's looking very nice today. I don't know, you probably didn't see on the conference website, but it's quite an impressive 19th century building, and we're in the original lecture theatre.
Wow, how cool.
Yeah, so we've got these alcoves. I can't show you because I don't want to mess around with the camera, but we've got these alcoves. So the audio-visual guys have set up in one of these alcoves, and they're working their magic from over there.
Great. Well, I really appreciate that work. And I totally wish I were there. It looks like a magnificent space.
It is actually nice. Yeah, it's on such a sunny day. It's a nice place to be. Unfortunately, our building, the biology building, is a 1970s monstrosity, which it doesn't compare with this Victorian grandeur at all.
Right. Yeah, I don't know what the deal is with the 70s. My office is in kind of the same era building, and it's
I guess that's when the biosciences really started to take off, and I guess a lot of those buildings were built at the same time.
Right, right.
But we're always dreaming about knocking the place down and getting a new building, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're hoping for paint on the walls first, right?
Well, yeah, no, exactly. I mean, in fact, we're hoping that they're just going to fix the leaks. I was over emphasizing our ambition, actually.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, we dream about it too, for sure, knocking it down and starting again, but then reality kicks in. It's like, all right, hope for new chairs or something. I don't know.
Yeah. And your kids have got to school. They've gone to real high school.
Yes, yeah. My first grader, they rode their bikes together today. My preschooler doesn't actually start until Thursday, but she dropped her brother off, and then we'll come back with my husband, with her dad.
That's great.
Yeah, and so far so good. I think everybody. So we just had a holiday weekend this past weekend.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think all the school officials are worried that parents and kids traveled, so we've gotten emails and text messages and phone calls like, if you're feeling sick, stay home.
You're not using antigen testing as much as we are, because the UK government decided to flood the country with free lateral flow antigen tests. So we're all taking them twice a week. Yeah, I mean, you can get them free from pharmacies. They're piled up everywhere. So this is part of our plan. They're not the most sensitive test. They're not as sensitive as PCR, but the idea is that they'll pick up enough to be useful.
Right, and testing twice a week, they're likely to be picked up. That kind of frequency feels useful.
Yeah, I think so. Having said that, I've taken a bunch and they're all negative so far. So eventually you start to feel, okay. I mean, the fact is, I think if you're not symptomatic, then the chances are that they're probably going to give you a negative result. But the idea is that if you're infectious and you're releasing enough virus particles to be infectious, then you've got a good chance of coming positive with these tests.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. No, we both kind of the U.S. writ large, but then also the University of Washington. I don't know. We've just plugged our ears to testing. I don't know.
I know that the CDC was very dismissive of the kind of tests that the UK government is using, but I think Massachusetts is maybe using something similar. But every state's doing something different, of course.
Yes. Yeah, that's the part that kind of kills me, actually. But anyways, Washington and Seattle specifically is pretty good in terms of the mask mandates, and vaccine mandates too, and things like that. I do wish that testing were kind of more part of the scope. I think that at the University of Washington, it's changing a lot right now. We don't actually start for another 3 weeks.
No, neither do we. Well, we've got 2 or 3 a week. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I think a lot of faculty are a little miffed, actually, that there's not more testing. So I think that the University of Washington is going to start testing students more. Like, either you have to get the vaccination or you have to test.
Yeah,
I don't know. I felt like I read weekly.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Let me get people in and tear them away from their coffee and biscuits. Okay. Yeah. You could meet Ellie as well. Ellie's waiting on the screen.
Lovely. Can she see the room?
Yeah, Ellie's
Us too.
Ellie's little camera. So this is Ellie, digital introduction. So this is Mona.
Hi, Mona. Really nice to meet you.
Nice to see you, Ellie.
So Mona is from the University of Bath.
Yeah.
All right,
I don't know
great.
if you know about Bath. It's a beautiful city in the west of England. With a great university.
How could you forget a name like Barclay?
Also, right? Exactly.
And it's because of the Roman baths. They
Yeah.
actually had baths there. So
That's how the city was named, Bath, the ancient Roman spa. It's a spa town. It's the only place in the UK which has a heated underwater spring. So 42 degrees is the water of the volcanic
it's
springs.
amazing.
It's a lovely place, yeah. UNESCO Heritage City.
Yeah. Yeah. When you come to the UK, then you got to go.
Oh, I've never been to the UK, actually.
Well, now you know we've got the hot springs of Bath. Then, yeah? It's one more reason to come.
Exactly.
It's near Stonehenge as well. You can drop by Stonehenge at the same time.
Oh, great.
All sorts of things.
So people are just coming in, so I'm sure
I'll leave you the mic. So Mom, there's the button there. It's not very obvious. So you just press the button, and as the green light comes on, I don't know if you want to use it now. It's up to you.
I was going to say for the second session afterwards for questions, what I was going to say is how you feel that question. Anyway, this one is running. Hopefully the caffeine's energized us all, right? Ready for the next plenary? Okay, so this is where the globe really becomes a very small place. Through the magic of Teams or Zoom, one of them? Teams. We have Dr. Ellie Theobald from the University of Washington joining us today to give us the second plenary on action-based learning, and I'm really keen to understand, especially from the STEM pedagogic background, what ideas and examples Ellie can share with us today. So over to you, Ellie.
Awesome, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
You hear me? Okay. I think I can see about half of you.
Yes.
On your left half. So yeah, so lucky me. I'm really happy to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation from Professor McAvoy to be here with you all. I'm sorry that I can't be in person, but indeed the marvels of the internet these days lets me be here with you. Okay, let me share my screen. I think that I'll disappear, which is better for you anyway. And let's see. Oh, right, I'm so sorry. My window's too small. There we go. Okay, can you see my slides now?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Super. I can still see you. You can't see me. Okay, great. Well, again, yeah, I'm really happy to be here. My name is Ellie Theobald. I'm an assistant teaching professor at the University of Washington in Seattle. I teach biology. My classes, like yours, don't start until the end of the month, when I will greet my 700 students all together in one room. It's a little intimidating thinking about that as we come out of the pandemic too, right? So I've been home for the last 18 months with just my family. Anyway, but nevertheless, I think that thinking about equity in our classes is particularly timely as we come out of the pandemic, because we've heard for sure about the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on different people across the world, and those exact people are coming into our classes. So my plan today is to tell you a little bit about my research, the stuff I've been working on lately, thinking specifically about how active learning can improve equity in STEM classes. So the kinds of inequities that we'll talk about a lot are kind of exemplified in this figure. So these data are actually coming from the state of California. But they're no different across different states in the United States, and also, as I'll show you in a second, same in the UK. So this is kind of just an exemplar to set the stage of what kinds of inequities I think about and we'll be talking about. So this figure on the y-axis is showing us the percentage of students who met or exceeded standards on the x-axis on a standardized test. On the x-axis is showing you 3 different grade levels. We have 3rd grade, 8th grade, 11th grade in 2 different subject areas, English language arts and mathematics. And the 2 different colored bars are showing you 2 different student populations. In dark blue, we're looking at low-income students, and in light blue, we're looking at high-income students. And you can see across grade levels and across subject areas, our low-income students meet or exceed standards at a lower rate than our high-income students. And so again, this is really similar to educational inequities, kind of regardless of what minoritized group we're looking at. So these data are coming from the Education Policy Institute, and it's showing you it's measured a little bit differently. This is measured as a gap in months. So how many months behind Black Caribbean students are compared to white British students as they're taking the GCSE. And so you can see both across time, there's been an increase in the gap between these 2 groups of students, and even at its lowest, a gap of 6 months is still a lot. So before we get too far into more of this, I definitely want to pause and talk just a little bit about terminology. So the kind of educational inequities that I'm talking about historically in the United States have been called achievement gaps, in the UK have been called attainment gaps. There is some move to abandon these terms. Some folks have adopted opportunity gaps. Other folks, myself included, I tend to focus more on trying to be very specific in my language in thinking about, either performance gaps or exam score gaps, or even abandoning the term gap at all and using the term inequity. So these two articles, the Quinn et al. Paper from 2020 and the 74 million blog post, really articulate why it's worth abandoning some of these terms. So this Quinn paper is one of the first papers I've seen actually that shows the language we use can actually bias our listeners and our watchers. And so for that reason, I am moving away from the word achievement gap or gap in general. The 74 million article is actually interesting. Some people are even looking at inequities or looking at gaps a racist idea at all, because we're preferencing the rich, white, typically male experience and comparing all other students to those students. I'm super excited to talk more about that later. I don't tend to agree with that perspective, but I understand it and I hear it. So why I'm so committed to thinking about differences in my classrooms and inequities is really nicely encapsulated by what Lynn Jennings from the Education Trust said. Right? She said that it's a problem if you're an 8th grader and you're speaking on a 2nd grade level. I think that is true, and we need to be sure that our education is accessible to all students. But And the kinds of inequities that we talk about are again, looking at BIPOC students, or David Asai from HHMI likes to use the term peer student, so persons excluded due to ethnicity and race. I think that is a really nice term that I've started to adopt as well. But also, it can ignore students from low-income backgrounds. So again, I tend to use the term students minoritized in STEM, or students from groups that are minoritized in STEM, to include low-income students. But kind of no matter what term we use, I want to be exceptionally clear that the inequities and the differences that we observe in our classroom are because of the context, not because of the students. So Starlet Sharp said it beautifully. We need to fix our institutions, not our students. So with that in mind, let's think about how we can be fixing our institutions and what we as instructors can do to fix the institution in our classroom and beyond. So again, probably, I anticipate that I don't need this kind of preamble in this group either, but I do want to say, just reiterate that there are at least 4 big reasons that we need to disrupt educational inequities in our classrooms and in our institutions. So the first is that completing a 4-year degree is the biggest driver of income inequality. So these data are coming from the United States, from the Pell Institute, published just a few months ago. It's looking at the percentage of students, percentage of 24-year-olds in the population who graduated from college, and it's broken out by family income quartile. So you can see that the highest income quartile at the very top line is graduating from college at a higher rate than the lowest income, students from the lowest income quartile. Said another way, so yeah, a 4-year degree is the biggest driver of income inequality, but said another way is that higher education is actually exacerbating income inequality, not ameliorating it. If our largest population are high income students, then they will just continue to get richer. So again, we need to change this pattern and fix the institution in our classroom. Next up is that the STEM workforce can't meet the demand. So again, a presidential report back in 2012 called for 1 million more STEM graduates. And we just cannot in the next 10 years. And we just can't meet that demand if we're systematically excluding parts of our population. Next up, perhaps again, it's a little trite, to be on Zoom and at the tail end of a global pandemic, saying that the world's problems are becoming increasingly complex. Of course, they are, and the more diverse our groups are in solving those problems, the more creative our solutions will be, and the more effective our solutions will be. And then finally, as a white person with power, as a college professor, I have a moral obligation to disrupt educational inequities in my classroom. It's not good enough to just want to solve the world's problems. I also want all students to reach their own potential and achieve their own goals. And when I signed up for this job, I committed to this moral obligation. So again, this is what we're up against. But as a college professor, it's really easy to think, oh no, that's a secondary school problem, right? I don't have these kinds of standardized tests in my classroom. I write very good exams. My students are in a particular grade and then they pass or not. But I have some data to show you that's just not true. These kinds of educational inequities persist, they persist when students arrive in college. They persist in classes until we weed out the BIPOC students, the students of color, and the low-income students. So these data are coming from University of Washington in a general chemistry course. So this course is required for all STEM majors on our campus. And what we're looking at on the y-axis is we're looking at the difference in GPA. GPA here is measured on a 4-point scale, and it's looking specifically at peer students compared to white and Asian students, or non-peer students. And you can see that the raw difference in grades is almost a half a standard deviation, which in this case is actually almost exactly the same as a half a grade. Even when you control for students' preparation, prior preparation, so their high school GPA, as well as their SAT score, so the college entrance exam here, a gap persists. It's smaller, but it still persists. We can also look at the probability of surviving this course. So here we're looking in the left panel, we'll look at the raw survival probability. On the right-hand side, we'll look at the survival probability when we're controlling for these two metrics of prior academic performance. And this time we're looking across the 3-quarter Gen Chem series and the 3-quarter O-Chem series in both cases. And so what we see is for our white and Asian students, there's a precipitous decline in course survival probability. That's not surprising to me, and it's probably not surprising to you either, just given who your students are in your classroom, right? The first year students come in, they're going home, they're ready to go, and then they decide, oh no, actually this isn't for me. So there is a decline in course survival probability. But that line is steeper. It's both lower and steeper for our students of color. And so our peer students are way less, disproportionately less likely to survive through the chemistry series than our white and our Asian students. And that, again, that pattern persists, that both peer students have a lower survival probability and a disproportionately lower survival probability over the 6-course sequence, whether we're controlling for SAT score and high school GPA or not. So I've never talked about these data without giving a huge shout out to my colleagues in chemistry. I've never seen a group of faculty move so fast as these folks. So they saw these data, and every one of them stopped smiling and changed their class immediately. Whether it's from really trying to change the way they teach the class, they started collecting data to understand why students aren't succeeding at the rates that they want to. It's really, really amazing and commendable. So as an instructor, then I think about, so this is the institutional context in my classroom that is the reality for students. And so I think about, as an instructor, I think about what can I do in my classroom to fix the institution in my classroom. And I wonder if active learning is a solution. So the purposes of this talk, I will be defining active learning as a suite of pedagogical techniques that really engage students in the process of learning, and specifically in the process of constructing their own knowledge. It looks like a series of activities or discussions that students do in class as opposed to just listening to the expert at the front of the room. It often involves higher order thinking, so students get the lower level kind of definitions and knowledge level stuff outside of class, and they come to class and apply that knowledge. And it often, but not always, involves group work. So for the purposes of this talk, my driving questions are: first, is active learning effective across contexts? Can active learning promote equity? And then what are some classroom implications of this? So the majority of the rest of the talk will really focus on the first 2 bullet points, but then I'll kind of end briefly on that last bullet point. So let's dive in. So thinking about if active learning is effective across contexts, to answer this question, we conducted a meta-analysis of STEM active learning. When I say we, it was a huge group of people spearheaded by Scott Freeman at the University of Washington, and we had 29 or 30 additional graduate students, postdocs, and post-fact coding papers for us. So this meta-analysis you can really think of as an update to the Freeman et al. 2014 meta-analysis. If there's one paper in this world that you read and really know, it's this Freeman et al. 2014 paper published in PNAS. So in this Freeman paper, they coded papers from June 1998 to January 2010. It had a total of 158 studies. Our paper picks up where they left off, and we continued coding through June 2016. We have a total of 133 studies. We use slightly different methodology, and so we have 230 case studies. You can think of that as classrooms in this case. We also tried to collect more information about the paper. So we wanted to know specifically what is it about active learning that's effective. And we looked at the type of active learning, the active learning intensity, so how much time students are actually spending with active learning in class, and a few other course characteristics. So I'm only going to share with you the results from the exam scores, but the results from the probability of passing the class were really similar. So we're going to build out a graph that looks like this. So I want to orient you to it before we got too far. So on the x-axis, we're looking at the effect size. It's measured in Hedges G. You can think of this as the effect of active learning. So what that means is if the effect is 0, it'll cross the 0 line, and that means the student exam scores are the same in active learning compared to traditional lecturing. And again, these are exams, and so the studies, in order to be admitted to our meta-analysis, the exams had to be equivalent, the course context had to be equivalent, there had to be a demonstration that the students in the active learning and traditional lecturing were equivalent, and the instructor had to be the same. On the left-hand side, if the effect size is negative, that means that students in the active learning class underperformed compared to the control or the traditional lecturing. If the effect size is positive, active learning, the exam scores were higher in active learning than in control, again, on equivalent exams. So associated with each point, I'll include a number in parentheses, and that number is the number of case studies, and specifically the number of case studies that informs that particular data point. And if you've conducted a meta-analysis, you will know intimately that there's high variation in what authors present in their paper, and so it's not surprising that the number of case studies informing a single point is gonna vary a little bit. Okay, so overall, we found from all of these studies, we found that the grand mean effect size was about a half a standard deviation. So again, what that means is that students in active learning classes earn about a half a standard deviation more on exams than students in non-active learning classrooms. Just take a drink of water. Okay. So then building this out a little bit, we're going to add a couple of categories. Those categories are going to have levels. So first, we looked at active learning type. So whether this is instructors who use clickers or some sort of personal response devices, collaborative groups, flipped classrooms where students do something outside of class, come to class to apply the knowledge, problem-based learning, studio learning, some sort of combination of all of these things, or this rather large other category. Because instructors are super creative, which is amazing. And so we combined them all together in this other category. We'll also look at class size. So as has been done previously, we considered a large class anything over 100 students, a medium class kind of the 50 to 100 student range, and a small class less than 50. And this is what we find. So open circles here indicate that that the confidence interval crosses the 0 line. So that point cannot be, is not statistically significantly different than 0. So what I want you to do just for a second is turn to the person sitting next to you and just unpack this graph. Think about it for a second. Is there anything here that surprises you? And then and digest these data, and then we'll come back together in a folder. So maybe take 1 minute at the most.
I don't know what studio means. I don't know what studio means. Suppose the size of the continent, a study and also I guess the size of the I suppose that was a problem. Categorising these approaches is not easy.
Okay, let's come back together in the folder.
They've taken the
Okay, let's come back together in the folder. Ooh, that was a first. That was so great. Again, I wish that we could be together. I'm a shameless eavesdropper, and I had no idea what any of you were saying because it's all just jumbled together. Anyway, okay, let me share my screen again. Totally great. I did this happen last time. There we go. Okay, super. Can you see the presentation again? Okay, excellent. So what I take from this, I would love to hear what you all take from this also, but what I take from this is that really lots of different kinds of active learning are effective in improving student exam scores. And same thing, a lot of different class contexts are, active learning is effective in a lot of different class contexts. So as somebody who teaches some gigantic classes and some small classes, for me, this difference here just is kind of it's just an indication that it's different. The kinds of things you can do with active learning in ginormous classes is just different than the kind of active learning you can do in really small classes. And perhaps those differences are meaningful for student outcomes. Did anybody come up with questions or things that you wanted to share with the group?
Yeah, I have. James, you want to?
Yeah.
Would you actually have seen greater effects if you did, because exam scores are really sort of picking up content. Would you actually see even better effects, particularly say with problem-based learning, if you had a different assessment tool and you were picking up more skills?
Oh yeah, okay, totally great question. So I think that there's kind of a couple of things about the answer to that too. So number one is I think how I would interpret part of your question is that exam scores can be really problematic, particularly for some students, right? Testing anxiety, things like this can be a huge problem. And whether or not the exam is actually measuring something meaningful for an instructor is also a big question. So we do see, I'm super excited, maybe we should start speaking up a little bit. We do see huge differences when we look at equities and inequities, big differences between exam scores and the probability of passing. So we'll get there. So I think you're totally right that, yeah, if you change your exam, you could definitely see differences.
Ellie, could you take one more question?
Yeah, one more, yeah.
Okay, you can't see me because I'm on the wrong side of the room, but I noticed in the parentheses the number of studies you've got. It seems that the smaller number of studies, the larger the effect. I'm wondering whether it is just regression to the mean, that the more studies you have, the smaller the effect.
Okay, so you were saying the larger
No, the number of studies, not the number of students, the number of studies. So clickers have only got 10 studies, collaborative group 67. So if you look down that, there's only one of those results. It's the studio one that bucks that trend. The more studies you have in your analysis, the smaller the effect.
Right. Okay. So I think studio. I mean, I'm not inclined to make a ton of inference about seven studies. So I tend to not put a lot of weight in that effect. This effect. Similarly, as you're reading the paper, a lot of papers say something like, "Yeah, I was in a studio classroom." Like lecturing to students, right? Thinking that there was something magical about the actual physical space where students are that would change exam scores. But we also have small class sizes are bucking that trend also. So I guess I suppose, right? There of course could be some regression to the mean happening, of course. But I don't think that, I mean, I don't think that is what's driving this pattern.
Okay.
Okay, super. Let's, so next up, we looked at intro courses and upper division courses. We looked across different subject areas, and we looked at active learning intensity. So the amount of time that students spend working together. So we looked at classes that spend more than 2/3 of the time where students are working together, working on something, as opposed to listening to the instructor. Medium intensity classes, and then also low intensity classes where students spend maybe more than 0, but less than 1/3 of the time working together. And we see that again, high intensity active learning and even medium intensity active learning classes are more effective than low intensity active learning classes. So we'll come back to that pattern in a second too. So what I take from all of this is that active learning, there's lots of different types of active learning that are effective. It's effective in any course level, class size, and subject area. And that low intensity active learning is really not much better than lecturing. So is active learning effective across contexts? Yes, generally speaking it is. And so then can active learning promote equity? So to answer this question, we did an individual participant data meta-analysis, again, comparing passive learning or passive lecturing versus active learning. To do this, we contacted every author from all of the 291 studies in both our meta-analysis and in the Freeman 2014 meta-analysis, and we asked authors for disaggregated data, and the data had to be disaggregated by race or ethnicity or family income or generational status, but no authors provided those data. We wanted exam scores and passing rates. And we got a number of responses. So we have, in this study, we have, or in this meta-analysis, we have 15 studies that looked at exam score representing almost 10,000 students in 51 sections. And we have 26 studies that looked at the passing rate, comparing active learning to passive learning for about 45,000 students in 170 sections. So we feel pretty good that our data set represents 53,000 students from 37 studies. But I definitely want to say that fewer than 14% of studies had data that they could share. And this is a huge problem because, of course, if we're not disaggregating our data, we are only measuring the majority. And so in my ideal world, we would have way, way more than 14% of studies, more than 14% of authors asking about equities and inequities in their classroom. For statistical, we combined students into this group of students for minoritized groups in STEM. Minoritized students who are minoritized because of race and ethnicity, and also because of family income. That's of course problematic, but for statistical reasons it was necessary in this case. And then ultimately, to answer this question, we fit hierarchical Bayesian regression models. I'm not going to go into those details, but I'm always super happy to talk about them. Okay, so can active learning promote equity? So what we're looking at here is two panels. On the left, we're looking at the difference in exam scores measured in standard deviations. And on the right, we're looking at the difference in passing. We're comparing passive learning to active learning. And the zero line, if a point or the credible interval crosses the zero line, there would be no difference in inequities in that class, and so there would be equity. And what we find is that on average, there's about half a standard deviation, 0.6 standard deviations difference between minoritized students in STEM and majoritized students in STEM in passive learning classrooms. And there's a smaller difference in active learning classrooms, both in exam scores and in the probability of passing. And specifically, these inequities are reduced by 33% on exam scores and 44% on the probability of passing a class. There is, of course, a ton of variation. So what these two histograms are showing you is the change in the difference between active learning and passive learning. And so any positive change, these classes are promoting equity in their classes. Any negative change, these active learning is impeding equity in their classrooms. And we wanted to know, we continue to want to know, what are some characteristics of classes that fall on either side of this histogram. So one thing we looked at, again, was intensity. So again, the amount of time that students spend actively engaged. In this study, we didn't have any medium intensity classes. We only had low intensity and high intensity. So here again, we'll look at exam scores and the probability of passing, looking at passive learning, low intensity, and high intensity active learning. And so what we find for exam scores is there's a precipitous decline in inequities with low intensity and high intensity classes, where the most equitable, although still not equitable classes, are high intensity classes. And we see a similar trend, but more pronounced for the probability of passing. So specifically high intensity active learning classes, there's a 76% reduction in probability of passing when instructors use high intensity active learning. So I want you to just talk to each other again just for a second. We are getting close to time, but just for maybe 30 seconds, and think about what is it about high intensity active learning that might promote equity both in exam scores and in the probability of passing. So go ahead and talk to each other and answer this purple question. hear from anybody. What do you think? What is it about high-intensity activity do you think that promotes equity, and so substantially, particularly for the probability of passing in class? And what did you all talk about? Yeah.
The usual suspects again. So this time, Phil, Dave, and Andy.
I was wondering whether or not whatever it takes to pass an exam is infectious, and the more the students talk to each other, the more it spreads between them. So they get to hear about how other students think and how they reason, and they adopt things that they think works, and they become more similar.
I love that idea. Yeah, the power of collaborative learning, it screams to me that. Yeah, totally. What else?
I mean, my thoughts are really the same as Phil's, that a student can explain something better to a fellow student using language they can understand, rather than us trying to explain it, expecting a higher level of comprehension than other place. But also a student is quite more willing to ask a fellow student about their, their failures in effect, than approaching us. So it's a fear factor.
Yeah, totally. So I hear two parts there. One is just the speaking the same language. Students speak differently than experts, and so they can explain complicated processes in ways that they can understand to each other better than an expert can explain this complicated thing. I also hear you talking about what I call psychosocial comfort, or what psychologists would call psychosocial comfort in a classroom. It can be easier to be vulnerable to a peer than to the professor. I think saying both vulnerable and there's a certain amount of comfort provided in turning to your neighbor and being like, what is going on here, right? And then the neighbor's like, yeah, I have no idea either, right? There's something very comforting knowing that you're not alone, even if you're on a completely different page. Yeah, awesome, thanks.
And
I think there's one or two others.
One more.
This is Andy. What I'm going to say now sounds horribly simplistic, but it may still be true. The students who fail are the students who haven't done anything. And active learning is making them at least do something and to and interacting with people. So I don't know whether just that simple fact is a partial explanation.
You will comply.
You will comply.
Yes, totally. If you're the only person snoozing in a class, then it's going to be easier for the instructor to call you out on that, and your peers too, right? If you're a peer and you turn to somebody and they're taking a nap, that's going to feel kind of crummy. So the peer pressure too of getting involved. Yeah, I totally love it. Yeah, you can't come to my class, for example, and check out in the way that I often checked out in my college classes. Totally. And was there one more I can't remember?
Anyone else?
We did have another suggestion.
Okay.
Which was that maybe the teachers who include active learning in their classes are the better teachers anyway.
It's just the better teachers, yeah.
And more students pass there.
So we can pat ourselves on the back.
Yeah. I think that speaks to two things potentially. One is potentially a bias in this study, right? Is the folks who are, this is a meta-analysis, remember, not all of our data came from published studies. We scanned great literature as well, and even just personal contacts. But yeah, you're totally right. The folks who are collecting data about their students and their student performance, those instructors are going to be qualitatively different than instructors who don't do those things. So yeah, you're totally right that perhaps a message from this is that we all should care more, and then our students will do better. Yeah, totally. I really like all of these ideas, and they really kind of congeal for me and for our group in what we call the heads and hearts hypothesis. So again, this isn't new necessarily, combining these two things, but I do want to articulate it for you. So the idea behind the heads and hearts hypothesis is that educational inequities really affect a whole student, right? It affects how students like class, it affects how students feel in class and in college and STEM, and in an ideal world, it's actually measuring what students know and are able to do. So it affects both their heads and their hearts. And so if we want to disrupt inequities, we need to be targeting both a student's head and a student's heart. And we think that high-intensity active learning really activates a student's head because it focuses, the highest quality active learning really focuses on challenges that students have. It's scaffolded in a way that demonstrates the instructor's pedagogical content knowledge, right? Like, I know what students are going to be struggling with, and I know how to help them through that struggle. It also provides immediate feedback to students, so they work together, they share out, and in that moment, the instructor can say, oh yeah, you're totally on it, or like, yeah, you're on the way, but what about this extra thing that you haven't thought about yet? And the group work. Humans are social, and so when students work together, it activates their brains in different ways than when students work alone. And we hypothesize that this kind of deliberate practice can have a disproportionate benefit on students who are minoritized in STEM, because again, we need this disproportionate benefit to be impacting equity, as opposed to just rising all ships. It can have a disproportionate benefit because it's like having a coach right there with you while you're learning. Like on a sports field, you would have, your coach is observing you and watching you and giving you this kind of immediate feedback. But in classes, that kind of coaching is maybe not as common in low-income classrooms, secondary classrooms, for example. So it could have a disproportionate benefit for minority students because it's repeated practice, it's intentional feedback, and again, it normalizes the struggle. It's okay that science is hard. It's okay that college is hard. Just keep working. The heart side of this equation, too, is the culture of inclusion that active learning, and specifically high-intensity active learning, can promote. And it really comes from the instructor's soft skills. I think we heard this in a couple of the comments that you all shared, too. Both that the instructor really cares more, and specifically cares, has a deep interest in the success of all of their students. They have confidence in the student's success, right? It's not good enough to say, yeah, I hope you succeed. I doubt you're gonna. Like, that's not good enough, right? The instructor really needs to have confidence in their students, and it provides the care and the sense of community in the classroom, that we're all in this together. It's fine to be struggling on this stuff that's hard. And a lot of that can come from the instructor. And again, this can have a disproportionate benefit for students who are minoritized in STEM because it provides the psychosocial comfort and the sense of belonging. When students who are minoritized in STEM, they're, right, by definition, they don't see themselves represented in the STEM fields. And so this kind of culture of inclusion can provide some of the comfort that's needed to really be vulnerable and work hard. And succeed, push yourself to succeed. And so we call this the heads and hearts hypothesis. A collaborator and I, Sarah Eddy, actually have some funding right now from the National Science Foundation to really test some of these hypotheses and look at a bunch of different classrooms to see if there are predictable elements of the deliberate practice and the culture of inclusion that instructors who are successful at reducing inequities do, so that then other folks who don't study this stuff can pick up a guidebook and say, okay, I should try this, and this in my classroom. And I say that partly too because we're of course always looking for participants in our study to contribute data. We're also always on the lookout for good postdocs and postbacks. So if you know anybody, I'd love it if you sent them our way. So, can active learning promote equity? Yeah, it totally can. Especially active learning that engages students for more than 2/3 of the class time. So I want to just end with some classroom implications. Because the first time I presented these data, a colleague and friend looked at it and said, oh, well, Ellie, what I see from this is that I shouldn't even bother with active learning if I'm not going to do high-intensity active learning. So I'd like to say that I thought on my feet fast enough to have a good comeback, but months later now, I have a good response for this friend, and that is that that's totally not true. You have to start somewhere as you're transforming your class from passive learning to active learning, and almost always the place to start is with low intensity active learning. But what I would say is keep going so that you hear student voices for more and more and more percentage of the time of your class, whether it's asking them for questions, developing worksheets for students, but don't stop with low intensity active learning. Continue to collect the data to understand how students and all students in your class are doing, and keep going. And of course, fix the institution in your classroom, because that's what you have the most control over, and then work to fix the institution outside of your classroom. There's a lot that instructors and faculty do to influence the institution, broadly speaking, and that is part of our obligation as well. So with that, there's a ton of people to thank for this study. Of course, all of my collaborators, and also all of the authors who contributed data to the study. And so with that, I'm happy to take questions now. I can monitor the Slack a little bit too, kind of throughout the day, so if things come up. And you can always email me at lej@uw if you have, or sorry, UW, if any questions come up.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Oh, okay. Right, open to questions. I think this was a very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much, Ellie.
Good, yeah, of course.
Some things to think for us in the UK too. It's not just a US situation, it's also the same in the UK. Okay, right, starting with you, and then you, and you.
So I've been really interested in active learning, and I've read some of your previous papers, so thank you very much for a brilliant talk. It's really inspiring. And what I'm trying to do over the last year is kind of keep my learning active. Can you hear it right? Yeah.
I think it would help me actually if you came forward a little bit. I'm so sorry.
I can do my exercise for the day.
Sorry, yes, I'm really interested in active learning. I've been trying to do it for years. So thank you for a brilliant talk. It's really inspiring. I've read some of your papers before, so it's great to hear you talk live. Try to keep my learning active and actually sort of shameless plug. That's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. But I wondered if you could give some insights or reflection on how you try to keep things active during the pandemic. So you spoke about how you've been working from home for the last 18 months. I'd be really interested to hear what you did and then maybe sort of compare my experiences.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Man, it's really complicated, right? We learn better when we interact with each other socially, right? And my cousin is great to interact with, but like I'm not going to learn biology from him. And so I think, it's crushing, actually, frankly, right? I think that what we're going to see when classes start up again in 3 weeks will be classrooms unlike classrooms I've ever experienced, actually. I anticipate that I anticipate some of that our soft skills are going to become way more important than some of our other things, because I think that students are going to come back very nervous, right? They're not like, I'm not the only one who hasn't been around other people in a long time or around big groups, right? I think even the way that I see you all sitting together, right? You've spaced yourselves out. That makes active learning harder, right? And the idea too, like, okay, turn to your partner and talk to each other, spread your germs, y'all. Like that's nerve-wracking. And so I think that we're gonna see a fair amount of anxiety from students. I don't know if it's the same for you all too, but we've gotten messages from upper administration saying, oh my goodness, our students are gonna be so far behind when they enter our classrooms now because they did their last year of high school online. It's going to be so terrible. So not only are students getting the message, like, you know, be careful so you don't get sick, but also like you're starting way behind everybody else. That is going to have huge implications for students' psyche. So I think that, yeah, again, then also managing my own anxiety about being in classes together, right? Like, we have a tough job coming up here in the fall, and I think that it's important that we take it seriously. And I'm totally convinced, 100% convinced, that learning in person is better than learning online. And so even if it might not be quite safe enough yet, it's important that we do it. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it probably didn't because it was a little more forward thinking than back thinking.
Thank you, Ellie. There are two more questions. If you don't mind, we move on to Chris.
Hi, Ellie. Thank you for that. So I want to ask a question which I'm not sure you'll be able to answer either because you don't know or because you, for consent reasons, you're not allowed to say. But in the paper that came out in PNAS in 2020, there were 3 of the studies in which the minority groups did very much better than the non-minority groups. So in the exam, I'm thinking about figure 2 from the paper, the exam scores, there's a number of the interventions are just above the diagonal line for so they're slightly better, but there are 3 of them that are outliers, and I wondered if you knew which those were and what the secret was of their success.
Yeah, what a great question. That is exactly what we have gotten funding from the NSF to understand better. We don't know, just from looking at those papers, there's not enough information to really know what it is about those classrooms, especially because those classrooms or those papers focus on the deliberate practice side and really don't mention anything about the psychosocial comfort in a classroom. And so we are also desperate to understand what those 3 classrooms are. And there's some, right, the folks who are super well-intentioned do high-intensity active learning, and it either doesn't do anything or students, there's a negative impact in equity. So yeah, we don't know yet, but stay tuned. COVID has kind of impacted our ability to collect data, of course, but stay tuned because in the next 5 years we'll be looking at that way more. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you, Ellie. Next question.
Hi. Just a quick question regarding when you mentioned the practice that we're actually working very well on for active study and attainment. But when you mention groups, is there a recipe or some suggestion you've got that we can create groups that are conducive to that sort of good outcome? Because often could happen that very good students gather together and less good students, so that doesn't work very well. No, like, I mean, it works to a certain extent, but how can we modulate this if we can?
Yeah, what a good question. So I think a really important part of this, at least as an instructor, is I want something easy also, right? Like, I don't want it so anyway, maybe I shouldn't start with that because it should. Anyway, so yes is kind of in a nutshell. There's some work that I have done that shows that you definitely want to avoid a dominator, like you have named, right? You don't want just one student in the group to do all of the work. And so things like jigsaws can help with that, where you really build interdependence among the different students in the group, right? You only give some information to this student, some information to this student, some to this student, and then they need to put it together in their group work. So that can be very helpful in avoiding dominators. I've also been involved in groups, or in projects looking at group size, and there does not appear to be, at least from a couple of these studies, there does not appear to be an ideal group size per se, or even the group permanence. So whether students stay with the same students for the whole term, or if you change partway through. I think either can be a good strategy. Making sure that students feel comfortable in their group is a big part of equity also, and a big part of reducing the probability of having a dominator. And so for some students, that might look like group permanence. And so in your class, it might be possible to have one or maybe two groups for the whole term. But for other students, them selecting their own group could be valuable in that. But again, if you have like really close buddies or quite young students, so I taught high school for a while, and the thought of letting my high school students choose their own groups was like a non-starter for me. And so again, you need to like think about your students, and if selecting their own group could be helpful. There's also some worry about letting students select their own group. Over time, there's some evidence to show that students will actually start gravitating towards more similar students. So maybe at the very beginning, when they don't know each other, the groups will be very heterogeneous, but by the end of the term, if they're choosing their own group, students will both they will have similar phenotypes, they will look alike, and will be like all the high-performing students will be working together, and all the low-performing students will be working together. And that is something worth avoiding.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm just conscious that there are lots of people asking questions with their hands up, and you have a few disappointed people in the audience. But for the sake of inclusivity and to keep equity among the population, there is an online question. I'll leave that as the last question. If you could give a brief answer, just conscious we have to finish by 5:15, that's all. Thank you, Ellie. The question is, in the graph that showed the 76% reduction in the pass rate difference for high intensity and low intensity seem to fare worse than the passive group. Do you have any comment or explanation for that?
Yeah, totally. So there's two things. One is that, would it be helpful if I pull that up so everyone can see what we're talking about? Let me see if I can do that really fast. Okay, so here, oops, bless you. Okay, here, this one. So, and the question, oops, can you see my cursor? The question is picking up on this pink dot in passing rate, where it looks like the low intensity is, there's a decrease in the probability of passing a class. So one thing to note first is that this difference is actually not statistically significantly different. So I would interpret the reduction with caution, but I do think, so that's kind of one half of the answer. The other half of the answer, though, is summarized as, what the heck is happening? Why is this low intensity not doing anything different than passive learning? And what we think is going on here is that the probability of passing, there's that really active learning pushes students right over the cusp. So we see a larger reduction in inequities in passing rate compared to exam scores, because even just a few additional points on an exam can be enough to push students from not passing to passing. And so just because of the binary nature of passing or not. And so we think that that's probably what's happening here, is that in this high intensity active learning, there are like enough students right on the cusp that an increase in exam scores and even just a handful of points will push them over to the passing class. We, in order to, kind of an alternative hypothesis that we guarded against is that a lot of times in active learning classes, there are more participation points available for students, right? Whether it's answering the clicker questions in class or completing the worksheets or something like that. But we made sure that the grading scheme in these classes that there was not more than a 10% difference in the grading scheme between passive learning and active learning classes. So we're pretty sure that this is not just because more students are earning more points.
Thank you very much for that, Ellie. And with that, I'm sorry we can't take all the questions, we just don't have time, but if you could put your hands together again for Ellie. Thank you again. I'm sure people will be in touch through email with you. And we move on to Emma Jones. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Thank you. Goodbye.
I'm so sorry. I pushed the hang up button, not the stop share. I'm so sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Thank you again.
Yes, excellent. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I'll hang up for real this time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. I'm just going to sound like a broken record by saying how nice it is to be here in real life. So thank you to the organisers for letting us come here. Oh, I've forgotten how to use one of these. Oh, it's not plugged in, is it? Silly me. How do I progress the thing?
There's another one there that might work better if you take that one.
Okay.
Is that one?
Yep, here we go. Okay, so my study is about open book exams. So the shift that we had to make to online learning meant that we had open book assessment thrust upon us. And I was interested, also from an inclusivity point of view, whether any particular groups of students were advantaged or disadvantaged by this change in assessment. So my question is, do open book exams level the playing field? For taking this study, firstly, I wanted to, as I've just said, see if any particular groups of students performed better than they would have done normally, or if any found it a particularly challenging change. And I thought about doing this back in summer 2020, and I tried to get my hands on some student data, but ethics kind of got in the way, so that's still a bit of a stumbling block for me. I was also interested to kind of get the student perspective, because we had a lot of discussions between the staff about the problems with open book exams, namely plagiarism, collusion, all manner of other things. And I felt that it would be quite easy for us to say, no, they didn't work, let's go back to the exam hall. And you know, I think we need to have a balanced view before we make those decisions. This one. So I've been in quite a pastoral supportive role for a lot of students this last year and a half. And so I may have a slightly, unbalanced perspective in that I supported a small number of students in a crazily stressed state through these open book exams. So I wanted to know, is everyone this stressed? Or, in general, has the student population found things less stressful than normal? And my final motivation was, actually I presented in the Bioscience 2019, And on my final slide, I said I was going to increase the use of authentic assessment. Little did I know it was going to be full-scale open book exams. So I feel like this was already something that I thought was important. And having experienced it, I wanted to make sure that I captured whether it had gone well or not, and whether we should keep doing it. Okay, so I'm just going to say this very briefly, because this isn't the important bit. So I collected 2 forms of data. I wrote a Google form to do a survey for students across the Faculty of Science. So we've got 7 different departments. And I got 308 responses, which I thought was all right. Students don't love surveys today, especially if they're about exams. It's a bit boring. So that might be about 10% of the student population. And I also ran some focus groups to get some qualitative data to support that. And those were both 3 with students and 2 with staff. So I was getting the perspectives of both staff and students. And I put all of that, the transcripts and free text questions from the surveys into otter.ai and did some thematic analysis, which was my first attempt at social science research, I suppose. So combining these 2 types of data, we identified 4 key themes. Firstly, we do believe that our data suggests that open book exams allow students to demonstrate their ability and assess real-world skills, and that they offer flexibility and inclusivity. On the downside, issues of collusion came up in both staff and student groups. So obviously it was a massive headache for staff, but also there was a real awareness amongst students that some people were doing this, and if they weren't cheating, they were at a disadvantage. So, I do think that's a big issue from both sides. And then the final theme was that clearer guidance and support is required. We did this in a hurry. It was never going to be perfect. And if we're going to carry on with open book assessments, or a mixture, we just really need to make sure that everyone knows what is expected of them and has everything laid out nicely. Okay, but these top 2 points here I also want to expand on over the next couple of slides. Right, so what you're looking at here is a heat map, and this shows the responses to the statement, open book exams allowed me to demonstrate my ability. And we've got strongly disagree, A, through to strongly agree. The depth of the colour represents the percentage of students in each group that answered in each of these. And they're split according to whether the students had declared a specific learning difficulty or medical condition. So at the top we've got none of the above, and then various other declarations. So I think the first message really is that students felt confident that they were able to demonstrate their natural ability using these open book exams. And although there's a bit of noise in the heat map and there might be some variations, there were no statistically significant differences between students in different groups. So it seems like most students are quite happy that they are able to demonstrate their ability using these exams. And then one of the themes that really came up lots in the free text comments and the transcripts were issues around what was being tested. So the students recognised that they weren't just having to regurgitate and recall. It wasn't about memory. So there were 404 different words relating to memory. And instead they recognised that this was a test of their real understanding, the knowledge, and their ability to apply that knowledge. Which brings me on to the point about authentic assessment. So, both staff and students acknowledged that these assessments were a better test of real-world skills. I'm not sure I'm really a fan of this real-world thing, because university is in the real world, and it's a bit unkind to suggest it isn't. But anyway, the point is, it it is more about, you don't just have to remember a ton of facts in real life. So there were a number of different comments about this, but I picked out a couple of nice quotes. So the staff member is saying, you would never write an essay under time pressures in the real world, so it doesn't feel authentic. And a really lovely quote from the student saying that memory tests aren't tests of comprehension, understanding, or ability to use available resources, which are more important in everyday life. So, this seems really obvious, but I think it's important for us to remember it before we reflexively go, oh, actually, there were loads of problems with open book exams. Let's just jump back into the example. Because we know that the focus there is on rote learning. In terms of stress levels, I've got two different graphs here where I separated the students on this side according to whether they declared a specific learning difficulty or health condition or not in blue. And then on the other side, this was about the use of the English language. So students who have English as a first language or are fluent in English were grouped together versus those who said no, they did sometimes struggle with the English language. And I think, the main point really is that there weren't any significant differences between these different groups of students. So, I don't think we've picked out anything other than a little bit of noise there. But you can see in both graphs that the largest response is that students felt less stressed. And the question was about the stress levels in the exam period as a whole, not just in an individual exam. So reasons given for them feeling less stressed were largely based on not having to remember everything, but also, that they felt that it was a more relaxed atmosphere, it wasn't the kind of pressure of the exam hall, things like that. There were also quite a lot of students in the middle saying that things balanced out. Some aspects were more stressful, some aspects were less stressful, so overall it was about the same. And then, I would quite like to see this a bit smaller before concluding that there's no stress with open book exams. About 20% of students actually found them more stressful than before. And reasons given for this, some of them I think we can overcome. There were points about, we gave them 24-hour exams. So if you're in a 24-hour exam, you are stressed for 24 hours. And we had students doing back-to-back exams and barely eating and sleeping. We said on the exam paper, we expect you to take 4 hours to do this exam, but they spent 18 hours and then they didn't go to bed and things like that. So I think there are things that we can do to reduce this. Okay, another of the themes, open book exams offer flexibility and inclusivity. So this came more from the free text comments. There were 97 different mentions relating to flexibility. So students liked the fact they could take a break, they could work around their home lives, things like that, didn't have to travel. And also there were 33 mentions of these exams being more supportive for students with an SPLD or health condition. In general, didn't find any statistical significance on things, but there were a few little differences here in that a greater proportion of students who had declared a learning difference or health condition mentioned the value of being able to take breaks, the fact that these exams were less intimidating, and also that they were better for supporting those with disabilities. So, I do think that open book exams are more inclusive, and I don't think we should simply rush back to the exam hall and return to our previous ways, as was previously mentioned. And that we should consider keeping some aspects of open book, certainly where we think it's appropriate. We have a major issue with unfair means, and I would be really happy to hear any suggestions on how we tackle that, because clearly, we want to make robust and fair assessments, and that isn't going to be the case if there's a lot of cheating going on. And finally, I do at some point want to get permission to look at the numerical data properly to see if these changes in assessment have done anything for the BAME and disability attainment gaps. If you'll forgive me for using that terminology. Okay, many thanks for your attention. I'd just like to also thank my collaborator, Dr. Louise Robson, from the School of Biosciences in Sheffield, and I will take some questions.
Thank you very much. And a particular thanks for me for sticking to time too. Thank you. Oh gosh, wow. Where do I start? Right, let's ask people who haven't asked questions before.
Thanks very much. My question is just about the at-home element of open book exams. Do you think that's important and that's relevant, or is there some sort of hybrid approach in the future where we can bring students into the exam hall but still do an open book assessment?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think providing students with an example setting where we can control the environment, probably giving them a bit longer and saying, you can bring in your notes, you can have access to 5 scientific papers, that would probably be an authentic assessment but control some of these problems that we've had.
And now I'm going to be really unpopular, but I was going to say Emma's going to be around for the evening events. We're going to be around for drinks,
yes.
And that would be the greatest time for you guys to follow up questions, if that's okay, just because we are already 5 minutes over, and I'm sure people must be tired. Thank you very much again, Emma. Ian, next. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to speak. Ian Turner from Derby, and as always, my co-collaborator, Dr. Louise Robinson, is handling all this work. So if you turned your eyes up when I talked about games, side when I've talked about escape rooms, groan when I talk about card games, I thought I'd go really safe this year and talk about tabletop role-playing games. I think Dungeons and Dragons is a tool for biosciences. So mine, unlike everyone else's talk, is more of a thought piece. Little talk about what tabletop role-playing games are. I'm just going to finish off by talking about something I have done and then some things I'm working on at the moment, and hopefully someone amongst here is a secret Dungeons and Dragons player. Brilliant. Let's talk later. I know I should have brought some games with me. So, what are tabletop role-playing games? I mean, role-playing games in higher education, old school, okay? We'll probably all use them or seen them. Discipline very closely aligned to ours, like medicine, uses role-play as a pedagogic tool, loads. I'm talking here about tabletop role-playing games. So, if you're thinking about an image, the image you should be thinking about is something like this, with groups of individuals round a table with a map, some figures, some dice, pens and things. I mean, how does it work for those of you who don't know? The central premise is you get a group of people together, normally 5 to 10, and everybody but one person takes on the role of a fictional character. You become them. The other person takes on the role of organiser, storyteller, or as we like to call them, the games master. And the games master controls the whole world, the environment, and everybody they meet within it. The whole game actually mostly takes place within the mind, not on the table. So everything down from what colour the trees are, what's on the fictional menu in a fictional pub, all takes place in people's collective imaginations. So it's really a collective storytelling game. And if you've never played a role-playing game, then you really, really should. It's fabulous. So it's a narrative-driven game, but there is a slice of chance. For example, your character maybe have a skill at climbing, and you want to climb a wall, so you roll a dice to see whether they get up there in one vault or slip down and hurt themselves. So it adds that slice of chance. And of course, the most famous tabletop role-playing game, roots down in the 1970s, is Dungeons and Dragons. So thinking of Dungeons and Dragons, some of you may be thinking about the stereotypes about people who play Dungeons and Dragons. So the archetypal stereotype is a middle-aged man with a metal t-shirt, bulging belly and a beard. And to be honest with you, that if you look at some of the early data from 1980, that was pretty true. Now that stereotype has been close to being shattered. So though the numbers are really hard to get hold of, if you go to the official manufacturer of Dungeons & Dragons, Wizards of Coast, they report up to 40% of active players now identify as female, which is a massive upswing in the last 10 years. And they also report good representation in terms of ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, people of different sexual orientations. So the type of people who play Dungeons & Dragons is not only more representative, but the age group has dropped dramatically. And that's partly due to two big cultural influences, which is Stranger Things, the Netflix TV series, which Dungeons & Dragons isn't a central story arc, but it's kind of a backdrop to the whole programme, and Critical Role, which is a Twitch stream. So basically you watch people play Dungeons & Dragons online. Did you know there was 110 million hours last year of live Dungeons & Dragons streamed on Twitch? So the game has had a problematic past. Its recent 5th edition rules have tried to get rid of some of those. So some of the horrible stereotypes in terms of gender, in its imagery, think Xena the Warrior Princess, and the way that gender and race are dealt with in terms of the powers. In the early editions, a woman character was always weaker than a male character. They've got rid of a lot of all that and a lot of imagery. They're really trying to upskill the game. They've got some very good rules for playing disabled characters and gender neutral characters. So I feel the game has moved forward a lot in terms of breaking those archetypes. Just to give you a sense, that £816 million the manufacturer made last year, a big chunk of that was Dungeons & Dragons. So it is popular. Why should we care if it's popular? I mean, look at what Ecology did with Pokemon Go about 3 years ago. That's why we should be taking notice. So what about tabletop role-playing game research? So there's lots and lots. I've particularly focused on stuff with Dungeons & Dragons. I think I've got every paper which has mentioned it ever. It's a real transdisciplinary subject, everything from literature to history to arts, etc. But there's three kind of areas where I feel there's some resonance with those in the room. The biggest chunk is around the kind of mental health benefits of playing tabletop role-playing games, and of course there's parallels with board games and jigsaws and all kind of other things as well. In fact, I saw several popular media pieces in the last 6 months about people playing Dungeons & Dragons online using platforms like Roll20 over the COVID lockdown to help themselves. There's a big chunk of literature about social development, so actual interactions, but also development of employability skills, creativity and all those kind of things. Some really interesting work, particularly on neurodivergent populations, people with autism and others, and how these games help them explore themselves in interactions with others. Because though the game's a creative storytelling game, there are quite constrained rules within that. And finally, as a pedagogic tool itself, actually using a role-playing game as a construct to base a lesson or a module around. And if anyone's really interested, this link here by an Australian group has got a collection of quite a bit of D&D literature across a range of disciplines. I've got plenty more if anyone really wants to see it. So kind of the intervention that I was interested in when I started playing role-playing games, thinking, what can I use this some way with my students, was within skill development. So Derby, like every other institution, I guess, the employability service is outside of the college, and it does some in-curriculum offering, which is more or less focused to graduate employment, CV building, all those kind of things. And most of the other offerings are extracurricular. You have to go to them. They are optional, and yes, there are carrots and sticks to make them go, but they remain optional. So me and Louise decided to run some optional skills development sessions based around Dungeons & Dragons. And the reason we thought we could do this is there's plenty of literature that looks at skills which you can probably recognise as being employability skills. These are what they call them rather than what I called them, and provide some evidence that Dungeons & Dragons can develop these particular skill sets. So we designed a Dungeons & Dragons adventure to develop skills in our bioscience and forensic science students. So what do? So we designed a 60 to 90 minute session. First thing is, oh my God, I can't get the students to sit down for 10 minutes, let alone 60 minutes. For 4 to 6 players who've never had any experience with tabletop role-playing games. And to answer the question someone's bound to ask me, at the end. In fact, the one time we did have someone who had played a role-playing game, they were more problematic than those who never had, because we kind of tamed it down to make it more accessible. They walk in the room, and we don't tell them what they're doing, we get them to roll up a character. So in role-playing games, your character normally has a sheet with all their scores in it, how good they are at climbing. But we modified this sheet to include things which we recognised employability skills, like public speaking, multitasking, and listening and such like. So they made a character. And this is part of our access into the game. And then we create a nice story. I act as games master, I put on the voice, I add some drama. Basically they fall asleep in the library and they wake up in this cold marble floor, they don't know where they are. And the basic idea is they've got to work out how to get out. Each room is closed and each room's got a single puzzle in it. So this room's got some wells in it with a lever on top. And basically the players have to work out, they have to pull the levers, but in sequence, in a certain sequence. When they do that, the door opens, then they go into another puzzle and another puzzle. So in a role-playing game, I'm the storyteller that plays interactions with each other. I tell them what happens. If they say, I'm going to push the door, I tell them what happens if they push the door. And we use all the traps like dice and those kind of things to add some drama and excitement. So the basic idea of the game is they wake up in one room and they go through a series of rooms, and in each room there's a different puzzle. And here there's a problem-solving exercise, there's some riddles around the outside of here. This one, the statue speaks, but it's about public speaking and pleasantries. They've got to answer the questions in a certain way. And each room is carefully designed with a different puzzle in mind. And here's just an extract from our kind of guide that we use about what the puzzle is and what skills we're looking to see people develop. And what we do is we reward the players as they're playing by giving them plastic coins or gems for how they interact within the game. We give them rewards. We've all got lots of things built in to make sure the game progresses smoothly. For example, Louise, she normally plays a non-player character. She sits there quietly, but if they get stuck, she suddenly, in the game, a little colourful imp appears in the corner, gives the clue, then disappears again. So we've got ways of moving things forward. We also control the players very carefully. Every game we get somebody who takes to it naturally and starts talking lots. And unfortunately, as they walk through this corridor, I roll a dice, a cobweb gets stuck on their mouth and they can't talk for 6 minutes. So we've got ways of stopping and making sure people explore themselves. When they get to the end of the game, basically, there's a wall which is back to the real world. They can see the library where they came from. But this little guardian appears and says, I can only let a few of you through. And the imp appears, stops time, and they've got a few minutes to prepare a speech to the guardian to be let through. And that's based on their character sheet and all the little counters they've collected. So they've got to kind of pitch themselves. So the very loose analogy is about skills acquisition and then presenting your skills to present, in terms of a CV. So we play the game, it's really good fun. And then once the game's finished, we close it down and we provide that very, very, very important 10-minute of context. What on earth have we just done? We don't want people walking out saying, just had a great session on Dungeons & Dragons. Great, what did you learn? I don't know actually. Yep, that context. So it's set within the framework of the normal extracurricular offer that the skills service offer and includes some important signposting. So we've run this game now 6 times. 4 of those have been on campus before COVID, and then I didn't think it was possible, but I've now done it twice online, and then one time I actually did it with 60 people, and the way I did that was that 4 people were playing at one time in the room, and the rest were watching it, lying in the room. They couldn't move, but they had their mobile phones, and they could text message each other, and they're using their chat dialogue, and we kept flicking people around, and actually it worked better than I thought it would. It took a lot of multitasking. So I found this exercise a real different way to get people to talking about the skills that they have, get them to reflect on their skills and get them to develop in a different way. Here's just some quotes. We have done a more quantitative analysis of the initial pilot. I'm now working with my colleagues in psychology to look at measures of student skills which aren't just them saying, yes, I've improved. More longitudinal study based on not just a single session but a longer series of sessions. I'm also working with Joe, mentioned lecture remotely at De Montfort University on a game which helps with decolonising the curriculum. Now, game, decolonise curriculum. When I say that, it even feels weird to me because can you make a game like that? But we're actually quite advanced on what I think could be a powerful discussion role-playing game to help students explore the literature base that informs their curricula. So my conclusion here is lots of people out there are playing Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games. There is a reasonable amount of pedagogic literature that says that these things are efficient. Perhaps it's another thing you should consider for your toolkit. Thank you.
Inspiring as ever. Ian, one quick question. Anyone? Yes, we're mesmerised by the Dungeons and Dragons scenarios. John?
I suppose, for me, it's got nothing really to do with bioscience, it sounds. So is that what you're saying? It's an extracurricular activity that's essentially generic, that anybody could use to any subject across the university, couldn't they?
Yeah, this one was. I mean, there are examples where they're more science-focused. Jo's got some on. She's got an escape room about biochemical skills. I've seen a role-playing game that looks at genetics using the different types of dragons and those kind of things. Basically just a framework or a tool around some of those core skills.
Yeah. Well, I guess it'd be nice if you could maybe angle it towards bioscience. Have you thought about doing that?
Well, yeah. I mean, so my other hat is forensic science. So, and that the investigative nature of that makes it much more applicable to it. There are some actually pretty good science role-playing games. It's trying to keep it authentic because a lot of what we do is not as exciting as walking around dungeons, is it?
Okay.
So, really short one. Would you be brave enough to make it compulsory or core? So, any cohort of students?
I'd be brave enough, but I mean, I don't know what my manager would say.
Depends on the marking criteria.
I'll tell you what, as I walk up the stairs, the most resistant people are normally ones who enjoy it most. It's always a painful, slow start. If you've got a good games master who controls the game, they're the people who always enjoy it most, the ones who wouldn't have come if they knew what it was.
Thank you very much, Ian. We have Vanessa Armstrong.
Excellent. So what's holding you between 3 drinks and a barbecue? So I'll go to time and thank you in advance for your attention and thank you for letting me speak today. So the title doesn't quite fit what I'm going to talk about, and as Emma's alluded to already a little bit with ethics, I'll crack on with some of the issues that I've been faced with for this study. So what we're really trying to look at with this study is attainment gap. Potentially attainment gap, how we're going to measure that, and looking at, amongst lots of opportunities, placements was one of them, so it's a bit bigger than what the title suggests. So back in 2017, I had 2 collaborators at Kingston and Liverpool University, and we were looking at placements. We did a large survey, and some kind of interesting things came out of that. One of those was that Newcastle students were a bit more reluctant to take placements than students at the other 2 institutions. And there were potentially different factors involved with that, which I was a little bit surprised with. So that kind of came back into my mind when we were planning this study. We looked at motivations, inhibitory factors that might affect their taking up opportunities, not just placements, but lots of different things. Shadowing, work experience, it was kind of quite a large umbrella within this study. We know that having work experience is fantastic. It's very beneficial to students, getting those positive graduate outcomes, which we're all hoping that our students can achieve. Confidence building, a lot of things have been touched on already. With Ian some of the skills that they could develop, they could get these through the work experience opportunities. But yeah, there's a bit of a thing that Newcastle students weren't quite, some barriers there that I hadn't anticipated. So what I want to do with this study was kind of follow that up and investigate a little bit further and work out, is it the students' characteristics, is it certain groups of students that perhaps are able to take some of these opportunities, is that having an impact there? And working out know that taking opportunities and engaging with these, it's potentially not all students that are doing these. I know from our school, the School of Biosciences, that there's certain students that crop up again and again and again, that they kind of collect this plethora of opportunities that the school and the university offers. And there's this group that I'm sure I'm not reaching out to, and so we need to kind of look a bit deeper at who those are. What might these barriers be? Might there be financial implications, caring roles, they don't feel supported? Might there be something going on there? With an idea at the end that I would provide these, the support, have initiatives both at a school level and at a university level, encourage all, so that these opportunities are available to everyone, that we're not sort of penalising or putting out any kind of particular group of students. So that was kind of the aim. So first of all, I need to answer some of these key questions. So we need to work out how many of the students are engaging with the opportunities and which students are engaging with the opportunities. But before I can even do that, I need to understand and know my student cohort a lot better. So this is kind of where the stumbling block is with the ethical approval, but we kind of have lots of data on a university as a whole, as a faculty, but we don't necessarily have our cohort data, and it is something that I think is changing, and I certainly think the cohort has changed significantly as a result of the pandemic. And by that, I think we have a higher percentage of local students. I think that's increased. Our numbers, we've got bumper numbers, I don't know how everybody else is, but the numbers for this year are actually quite scary. So it is dynamic, it is something that is changing. So yeah, I kind of think maybe there are certain groups that are and certain groups that aren't engaging with these opportunities that I believe are career enhancing. These inhibitory and motivational factors, are they the same for all? We're all different, so probably not. And what influence does this sort of uptake of these opportunities have on their attainment? So looking at potentially at marks, but again, there's a few things that I need to sort of get over the hurdle of getting that data, but also with the graduate outcome data. Has anybody here seen the graduate outcome data for their schools? Yeah? And it's not quite what I was hoping it was going to be. It's been quite disappointing. The percentage response rates, the amount of data that I've actually got is really quite minimal compared to the daily data that we had before. So it's going to be quite difficult to work from. We've got the new data due in about 3 weeks as well. So lots and lots of things. So the approach, and this is all very much plotting and planning, because I was a bit naive at the start of this, that we were going to get the characterisation of the students and the demographic data from the UCAS registration data, which is harder to get than I had initially thought. We're going to run a large student survey across the life sciences, so that's not only our school, but also within another faculty where they offer life sciences, asking about students what some characteristics that aren't captured in that registration data, and that can be dynamic. Again, they can register and then this can change throughout the 3 years. Asking about what opportunities they've taken, what inhibitory things, motivational things have impacted their decision to take these opportunities. So that's a student survey that is all ready and set to go. We're hoping to do student interviews as well, again dabbling with a bit of social science type research, interviewing and transcripts. What we're looking at with these opportunities is an ever increasing list, and we have to keep reining it in. So by these opportunities, I've mentioned placements, so placement years, summer placement, lab assistant roles that we have, a term time position. We have these awards that students can take, mentoring, jobs on campus, they can do language modules. There's so many things, but all these are very much the students are electing to do them. None of them are compulsory. We're going to run some focus groups, hopefully get some good attendance and be able to run these in person. And that good old graduate outcome data, I'm really hoping that I can, if I keep pestering the people that, from our planning department, they will actually give me the crude data and I can work with that and get something more meaningful. So, submitted the ethical approval and the DPIA form quite a while ago, and we're still waiting for full ethical approval. Why this might be an issue is that I want the student numbers in the data, because that's going to be how I'm going to link this sort of central data with all of these opportunity data. because otherwise it's kind of meaningless. I don't know which student's done what over the past 5 years, so it's going to be quite a lot of data. We've got the survey ready to go, so we've had quite a lot of input on that, and it took longer. We're going to be using DISC as the platform, and it's who's got control of all these data that I'm hoping to collect. Who are the gatekeepers? And that's taken quite a bit of time, networking, establishing links. It's almost like a favour that people are giving you, is trying to keep everyone sweet and on side, that they will provide the data once I get that approval, and hopefully in the format that we need for the study. We've also got done a bit of research on sort of demographic issues faced by cohorts, looked at other institutions. We've looked at most institutions that are represented here, working out what people are doing and what approach they've taken for extracurricular activities to ensure inclusivity. So we've done quite a bit of that work while we're waiting for this ethical approval. So this is a little bit on the depressing side, so I might just gloss over this. It's kind of what our original plan was and where we're at the moment. So it's not quite where I'd want it to be, but there's also been impact from getting access to the data, but also with people being on annual leave over the summer and things like that. They're all kind of little stumbling blocks that we've faced, but it is moving in the right direction. So what we aim to do, and this is something I've been talking to people at the breaks about what we would do when we've got this information, and this is where it gets quite tricky. So potentially thinking about targeting support for specific groups, specific cohorts, whether we can get the university put some money behind this, so we can get some financial support, grants and bursaries to perhaps encourage some of these opportunities to be taken by students that might have inhibitory factors related to finances. Think about other subject areas as well. We're just focusing on the life science for this, but it could easily apply to any subject area within the university. And the idea is really that the goal is to get better graduate outcomes for all of our life science students and have something that is accessible and that students can take up rather than just having those small groups of students that sort of collect opportunities. So that's kind of the ultimate goal. So that kind of brings me to the end. It's a team project. We've got Damien, who's in the audience. He's part of this from an EDI perspective. And I've got 2 fantastic student interns that have done a brilliant job, and I'm going to keep them all over the next academic year. As we finally get access, I'm optimistic we're going to get the data and they can start doing the number crunching. We've got funding from the University Education Development Fund to be able to do this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Brilliant job. Good luck with the DPIA, and also thank you again for keeping to early time. We have time for questions, and Nick, and I apologise for not knowing any.
It depends what you mean by extracurricular, isn't it? So is it within the working hours of the university 9 to 5, or is it in the evening? Because some students, it depends how heterogeneous your populations are. So I'm from a Post 92, very ethnically diverse population of students, and lots of them work, lots of them have care responsibilities, lots of them have a curfew. And that only came to me when I took a student to an evening function. She looked at her watch at 9 o'clock and said, "Oh, I have to be home." I said, "What were you on about?" I brought him to a swanky dinner at a posh hotel. "Oh no, my parents expect me home at 9 o'clock." So these are unwritten things and unknown things that we don't know about. So if it's extracurricular in the evenings and weekends, that will limit accessibility to students. So if it's extracurricular within those working hours, you might get a lot more buy-in from those underrepresented groups.
That's a good point. I mean, it's what data we can capture, but the survey should hopefully capture some of that, and we can get students to add that data. But yeah, it's another thing, isn't it, to think about for them.
And one last question. Go on.
Just to be clear, this is also to promote placements in your to promote activities for your students. Definitely. So, if you what do you think in terms of, so how do you see this, when you start building your content, for example, the placement, one of the things that I find personally after 5 years of doing this is that one of the best way of losing them is to send a student who is not moving. So that's something that is always difficult to balance because you mentioned also interview. But when you interview the student, it's so evident that the students who got more placement keep getting placement. So it would be, I understand the point, which is more like, okay, let's help this one. But then you have also duty with the placement providers. So how do you go about that dialogue, knowing that they won't get the best students?
Right, so I'm a placement coordinator for the school, it is something that I've had a challenge and quite a stressful challenged student in exactly that situation. So how I've dealt with it is that I've ensured that the companies now have a really robust selection process that I'm not directly involved with, that they go through that, and it will be more the support, the pre-getting to that stage, that I would be looking at helping the students that aren't the strongest in trying to get them to a place. But you've got to send your good students, otherwise you're going to break the links, and that happened to me in a situation, and it was a bit of a disaster. But yeah, it's quite a sensitive issue as well. But yeah, I think being open and honest and with that company, because it can have detrimental effects for many students in the future, couldn't it?
Okay, can we thank all three speakers for this afternoon? And the news you've been waiting for. James.
Thanks, Mona, very much for your chairing. Thanks to all our speakers. This is the deal now. The bar and dinner are at Crosslands, which is just the other corner of this quad. So you just walk out of here and just walk diagonally across the quad. That's where the drinks are, and that's where dinner will be. Those of you who are staying tonight, if you want to collect your luggage from wherever you've left it, perhaps at the back of the room, and I can lead some of you down to the Reed buildings where your rooms are, and you can check into your rooms down there. So that's it. Thanks again for everyone who's contributed.
So I thought a resource like this, so I'm thinking of getting a graphic to do the drawing, get my students to create the content and having a rudimentary attempt at something like this. So I did it with an idea that
publishing house might be interested in.
Yeah, I think we might be interested in it. I can see it working in a kind of bank of case studies type way. Because, yeah, I think that could help an enormous amount of people. I think it could be something that helps students. I think it could also be something that helps instructors who want to be able to highlight scientists in their own lectures or teaching, whatever. I can see it as a student and an instructional source. And something that we can keep adding to as well. So that it's not just... one of the challenges we found is we've been going through lots of our big textbooks and resources and looking at, well, who have we chosen to feature, who appears on the stage, and sometimes the results have been embarrassing, especially for our older textbooks. So we've been having a big project to go through and say, right, we need to really update and make sure that we're representing everybody. One of the things we found is that because of the history of the world, unfortunately, there aren't, you go back a certain number of years and there just aren't many people with certain technologies, they don't have opportunities. So I would very much want to see it not kind of only historical figures, although I think it is important because sometimes there are more than we think.
Yes.
But also who's working now. So examples of people in our time who we point towards too.
Right. Yes.
Historical and current.
So I'm going to rudimentary go at this first, I think, in-house. So I ran past the British Pharmacological Society and they told me that even though they had an education grant call, the deadline had passed. It was all taken by this, send us in something quick by Friday. So it's possible I get some money to employ a graphic artist, cartoonist, and then get a final year undergraduate student to give me some brilliant content and then try and draft it up. So if I got that far, could I send some stuff to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd be really interested in seeing that.
Okay, good. Yeah. That's good. All right then. Anything else you'd like to know about that?
I've unfortunately got to go and get trained,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I don't feel I've got time to
No,
ask questions,
problem.
but let's be in touch.
Okay,
And
definitely.
I'm sure I will have more questions.
So lots of people here thought it was a good idea. So it's because I'm involved with the Royal Society of Biology and the Attainment Gaps network. And James is a co-chair of that group. BAG network, Virginia Attainment Gaps. And I ran that by them in a meeting a couple of weeks ago and everybody jumped on it. So I thought, we need to do something a bit more proactive about it. There you go. Okay.